It was the summer of 1920, in a quiet farming community on the flat plains of Oklahoma, when a family gathered on the porch of their modest wooden house for what was supposed to be an ordinary photograph. The father, proud in his Sunday suit, stood with one hand resting firmly on the rail. The mother, her hair pinned neatly, clutched the youngest child at her hip. Their older children arranged themselves in front, some fidgeting with impatience, others trying to mimic the serious stillness expected for a picture. A neighbor who owned one of the few box cameras in the area pressed the shutter with a cheerful laugh, capturing what should have been nothing more than a portrait of rural American life. At first glance, the picture seemed no different than dozens of others tucked into albums of that era. Stiff poses, pressed clothes, shadows cast by the afternoon sun. But when the film was developed days later, murmurs began to ripple through the town. Neighbors noticed first. One of the children's faces appeared unnervingly blurred, as though in motion. Yet those who had been present swore the child had stood as still as the others. Behind the mother, who smiled faintly, there stretched a long, indistinct shadow. No one recalled a person standing there, no figure near enough to cast such a mark. The longer people studied the photograph, the more unease grew. Was it simply a trick of light, an imperfection in the primitive camera lens? Or had it captured something else, something that should not have been there at all? What followed in the months after only deepened the mystery. A sickness struck the household, first claiming the eldest son in the dead of night. The father, once strong, began to waste away, his health crumbling without clear explanation. A younger daughter vanished entirely while walking to school, her footprints fading into dust along the roadside. By the time winter came, silence filled the once busy home. Some neighbors insisted the tragedies were nothing more than the cruel hand of fate, common enough in an era of poor medicine, harsh weather, and fragile livelihoods. Others, however, whispered more darkly that the photograph had foretold what was to come, that it had not captured a family at all, but something already unraveling them from within. The image, tucked into a family Bible and later rediscovered in county archives, has survived the decades. Faded, grainy, and cracked, it still carries an uncanny weight for those who see it. Was it an omen? A coincidence? Or the moment when an unseen presence was frozen onto paper for all to witness? This documentary seeks to reopen that century-old riddle, peeling back layers of history, psychology, and folklore. At its heart lies a chilling question. Can a single photograph reveal truths no one wished to see? Or does belief itself breathe life into shadows that were never there? The photograph that would come to haunt an entire town was taken on a summer afternoon in 1920 in the rural stretches of Oklahoma, where wheat fields swayed under heavy winds and dust already hinted at the storms of the following decade. The Sayers family in question, the Callahans, were not strangers to their neighbors. They were known as hard-working, devout, and relatively prosperous for their time. Thomas Callahan, the father, had returned from the Great War with scars along his arm and a limp that slowed his gait, yet he carried himself with a pride that marked him as a man determined never to let hardship define him. His wife, Margaret, managed both the household and the small patch of farmland they owned, tending to chickens, baking bread that filled the air with the smell of yeast and warmth, and ensuring her children grew with discipline and prayer. By all outward appearances, theirs was the sort of family that fit neatly into the American imagination of the time. Simple, God-fearing, and built upon labor. The photograph was meant to mark a moment of continuity, a frozen glimpse of family life after the chaos of war and influenza. Their neighbor, Henry Fields, was one of the few in the county who owned a box camera. Photography in those days was still something of an event, not yet the casual snapshot it would later become. When Fields offered to capture the Callahans, as a gift, Margaret insisted the family dress in their best Sunday clothes. The children, restless with the summer heat, were scrubbed and buttoned into stiff garments. The father's suit, though slightly worn, had been brushed clean, and Margaret herself wore a pale blouse tucked neatly into a long skirt, her hair pinned back with modest precision. The setting was their porch, a wooden structure whose boards bore the marks of decades of footsteps, both heavy and light. The house behind them was plain but sturdy, built by Thomas's own hands with the assistance of his brothers before the war. The photograph captured a common scene of rural American life. A family arranged carefully, stiff with the awareness that their likeness was being preserved. At first glance, nothing appeared remarkable. Their expressions carried the solemnity expected of photographs at the time, when smiling broadly was still uncommon. The afternoon sun spread across the boards, and the children squinted faintly, unused to the unnatural stillness demanded by the camera. When the image was developed days later, however, curiosity gave way to unease. Neighbors who came to admire the photograph noticed details that unsettled them. One of the children, Samuel, the youngest boy, appeared blurred, as if shifting during the moment the shutter snapped. Yet those present insisted Samuel had stood quietly, obediently, his hands clasped in front of him. Behind Margaret, near the porch's shaded corner, a long shadow stretched against the boards. At first, it was assumed to be cast by a neighbor, perhaps Henry himself as he stepped back from the camera. But when the angle was studied, doubt set in. No one had stood in that position, and the lines of the shadow did not match the light. Some swore it looked like the figure of a man, taller than Thomas, shoulders hunched as if leaning close. Officially, there was nothing amiss. The county paper printed the photograph in a small feature about rural families, praising the Callahans as examples of stability in an uncertain age. But in the quiet exchanges of neighbors, the whispers began to spread. Photography in the early 20th century was still surrounded by mystique. Some believed a camera did not merely capture a likeness, but held the power to steal or reveal something deeper, the essence of a person, even the trace of a soul. The blurred child became the subject of hushed speculation. Had Samuel been restless, or had the camera captured some part of him that was slipping away? The shadow behind Margaret was even more disturbing. Some dismissed it as a chemical imperfection in the plate, but others leaned into older folklore. In certain traditions, shadows were thought to reveal spirits or demonic presences lingering around the living. A mother flanked by an unnatural silhouette suggested not protection, but intrusion. At church gatherings, interpretations multiplied. The Callahans, outwardly respectable, were rumored by a few to have prospered too quickly, to have purchased their land under circumstances less than honest. Others pointed to Thomas's war experiences. Perhaps, they said, he had carried something back with him from Europe. Not merely injuries, but a stain upon his soul. Such gossip had little grounding, in fact. But the photograph seemed to provide proof that something hovered around the family, whether guilt, sin, or a darker presence. Margaret, for her part, insisted the photograph was ordinary, a simple family portrait. She scolded neighbors for indulging superstition, and Thomas himself laughed at the idea that a trick of light could suggest anything more. Yet the unease did not fade. Instead, it grew as the tragedies began. Within months, illness swept through the household. Their eldest son, Robert, fell sick one evening, his body racked with fever. The doctor attributed it to influenza, though the pandemic of 1918 had largely receded. Weeks later, Thomas himself began to weaken, his strong frame reduced by fatigue and unexplained weight loss. When their daughter, Clara, disappeared on her way to school, the whispers sharpened into conviction. The photograph, people said, had shown what was to come. The blurred child was a warning, the shadow a mark of doom. But there were other explanations, equally compelling to those less inclined toward superstition. Photographic plates in 1920 were vulnerable to imperfections. A small slip of the hand during exposure could blur a face. Shadows could appear from uneven development, from chemical inconsistencies, from accidents in the darkroom. To those with knowledge of the process, the Callahan photograph was simply flawed. The tragedies that followed were cruel coincidences, nothing more. Illness and disappearance were, after all, part of life in a world where medicine was limited and dangers many. The power of the photograph lay not in its physical properties, but in its timing. It was captured in an era when photographs carried weight, when families believed such images might preserve not only memory but destiny. To hold a photograph was to hold a fragment of eternity. In that context, imperfections were never merely mechanical. They were read as signs, as messages, as glimpses of truths otherwise hidden. For some, the Callahan photograph was a sacred omen, a mirror reflecting not just the family's likeness but their fate. For others, it was nothing more than a flawed attempt to freeze time, burdened by the imaginations of those desperate to find meaning in tragedy. The debate between innocence and corruption became central to the photograph's legacy. Was it a harmless family portrait, marred only by a damaged plate? Or was it a cursed image, revealing a hidden truth about the Callahans that no one dared speak aloud? The answer depended less on the photograph itself and more on the fears of those who gazed upon it. In that way, the photograph transcended its original purpose. It became not merely a record of one family's moment in time, but a canvas upon which an entire community projected its anxieties, suspicions, and beliefs. As decades passed, the story of the Callahan photograph persisted, woven into local folklore. Children were warned not to stare too long at photographs, lest they see something waiting in the shadows. Farmers spoke of the Callahans as a cautionary tale. Prosperity gained too quickly, faith tested too sharply, a family undone by forces visible only in hindsight. The photograph itself, faded and brittle, moved from the family Bible to county records, but its power never diminished. Each time it was rediscovered, each time eyes lingered on the blurred child and the unnatural shadow, the same unease returned. In this way, the photograph marked the intersection of history and myth, of science and superstition. To the historian, it was an artifact of rural life in 1920, representative of the era's photography and the fragility of family existence. To the villager, it was proof of a curse, an image that foretold the tragedies that soon followed. Both interpretations were true in their own way, for both revealed not only the fate of the Callahans, but the fears of those who surrounded them. And as we turn to examine the events that unfolded after that fateful summer, the photograph remains at the center, a silent witness, a blurred face, a shadow no one could explain. The Callahan photograph, with its blurred child and looming shadow, did not fade quietly into the family's history. Instead, it seemed to trail calamity behind it as though the camera had captured not just a moment but a sentence. Each passing month after that porchside snapshot brought with it new whispers, new suspicions, new evidence that the Callahans were touched by something unnatural. In the ledgers of county clerks, the tragedies that followed appear plain enough: an untimely death, a vanishing child, an illness that claimed the weak. Yet in the murmurs exchanged at church gatherings, in the testimonies of neighbors decades later, the picture became something darker: an omen, a curse, a doorway through which sorrow entered. Whether coincidence or curse, the Callahans' downfall etched itself into both written record and rural memory, leaving behind questions that no official statement could fully silence. The first misfortune came swiftly. Thomas Callahan, father and patriarch, was known in the town as a man hardened by war, but softened by devotion to his land and kin. He had survived the trenches of Europe during the Great War, returned with lungs scarred from gas and a limp that slowed his stride, yet he pressed forward with quiet resilience. Less than a year after the photograph was taken, Thomas was discovered lifeless in his wheat field. His body lay sprawled in the furrows, his face contorted, his hands twisted into the earth as though clinging to it in desperation. The coroner cited natural causes, likely a seizure or sudden heart failure, but whispers soon drowned out the official verdict. "Didn't you see the shadow behind Margaret in that picture?" one farmer asked another. "Didn't it look like something leaning close, waiting?" Speculation thickened like fog. Some muttered of poisoning, hinting at disputes with rival farmers over boundaries and irrigation rights. Others recalled the blurred face of young Samuel in the photograph, interpreting it as a warning that the family line itself was under threat. But the most unsettling theory, repeated in low tones around kitchen tables, was that Thomas had not collapsed alone. A witness, though her name was carefully left out of the sheriff's notes, claimed to have seen a dark figure standing in the field that morning, only steps from where Thomas later fell. When she blinked, it was gone. Rational minds dismissed it as a trick of light, the shape of a scarecrow or a gust bending the stalks. Yet the memory lingered, fueling the belief that Thomas's death was not merely untimely, but inevitable. With Thomas gone, the Callahan household shifted into unease. Margaret, once admired for her strong hymns and steady demeanor, began to retreat into silence. Neighbors visiting with sympathy baskets found her staring out the window for hours, her eyes fixed on the porch where the photograph had been taken. She refused to remove the picture from the mantel. Instead, she dusted it daily, handling the frame as one might a sacred relic. It was as though the image had become both curse and comfort, something she feared yet could not abandon. The family's second blow struck with even more violence to the community's peace. Clara, the eldest daughter at 12 years old, disappeared on her way to school. She was last seen by a neighbor, who waved as she walked down the dirt road, clutching her books against her chest, ribbons bouncing in her braids. By mid-morning, she had not arrived at school. By evening, search parties scoured the fields, riverbanks, and barns. lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the dusk. Nothing was found. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no disturbed soil. It was as if she had stepped out of the world and into silence. The sheriff filed Clara as missing, presumed runaway, but few believed it. She was known as obedient, content with her life despite its hardships. Rumors quickly coiled around her vanishing. Some whispered she had been taken by a drifter. Others said the land itself had swallowed her, the earth repaying old debts. But among those who had studied the photograph, a more chilling explanation prevailed. The shadow had claimed another. First the father, one neighbor said, now the daughter. That picture wasn't just a picture, it was a warning. Inside the Callahan home, grief became suffocating. Samuel, the blurred child of the photograph, began telling his younger sister Ruth about a man who stood at the end of his bed at night. He described him as tall, silent, always watching. Ruth confirmed the story years later, recalling that she too felt the presence, though she never dared look. Margaret scolded them for spreading tales, but her voice carried no conviction. One neighbor recalled visiting the house and overhearing the children whisper, "He doesn't like the picture. He says it wasn't meant to be taken." The phrase, half nonsensical, half prophetic, became part of local lore. Lights flickered in the Callahan home at night, though no lamps were lit. Passing children swore they heard multiple voices within, more than the number of living family members. When Margaret was asked, she replied only that the house was too full. The choice of words unsettled her neighbors. Too full of what? Too full of whom? The tragedies unfolded in two competing narratives. One was rational. Thomas died of lingering war injuries. Clara fell victim to abduction or misadventure. Samuel's frailty was the natural result of his poor health. Poverty, disease, and grief explained the rest. The other was supernatural. The photograph had not just captured faces, but had captured a fate. The blurred image of Samuel was seen as a foretelling of his early death, which did indeed come when illness overtook him before adulthood. The shadow behind Margaret was said to foreshadow her hollowing spirit, her descent into silence. Clara's absence was the cruelest confirmation, a void that seemed to mirror the void in the photograph itself. Folklore blossomed where logic faltered. Some claimed Thomas had made a pact overseas, a bargain for survival in the trenches that had followed him home. Others said Margaret had prayed too fiercely for prosperity, and her prayers had twisted into curses. Still others insisted the Callahan's wealth in land and harvest was ill-gotten, and the photograph revealed divine justice at work. Every theory, though contradictory, gained traction. When fear grows, it does not demand consistency, only repetition. Samuel's eventual death sealed the myth. His blurred likeness in the photograph was held up as proof that the image had seen what others could not. Ruth, the last surviving child, carried her memories into old age, but she rarely spoke of them. When pressed, she said the house had always felt crowded. Not with people, she clarified, but with something else. Shadows leaning in doorways, movement glimpsed in mirrors, a sense of being watched even in solitude. What survives today are both the official records and the whispered recollections, standing in uneasy opposition. On paper, the Callahans' misfortunes were tragic but explicable. In memory, they were haunted, undone by a single photograph that bound them to forces unseen. The tragedies that followed cannot be disentangled from that captured moment on the porch, where smiles froze and shadows lingered. Rationalists insist it was coincidence. Believers point to the photograph as a map of destiny. The truth, like Clara's vanished steps, remains lost. Science demands proof. Superstition thrives in the absence of it. Between these poles lies the story of the Callahan photograph, a single frozen moment that, depending on who speaks, is either a technical accident or a supernatural prophecy. To the rational mind, the blurred child and looming shadow can be explained through mechanics, a twitch of muscle during exposure, a fleck of dust on the lens, the way light bends when filtered through glass. To the fearful mind, those same distortions become undeniable portents marking a family for ruin. The question is not only whether the photograph was flawed or cursed, but also why human beings cling so fiercely to one interpretation or the other. Logic offers answers, but dread offers meaning. When the photograph was first developed in 1920, photography was still regarded with a degree of mystery. Cameras were no longer new inventions, but in rural Oklahoma, many families still treated them as rare and powerful devices. The Callahans had posed with pride, knowing that the single plate might serve as their legacy for decades to come. Yet when neighbors gathered to admire the finished print, attention quickly turned to what seemed wrong. Samuel's face appeared blurred, smudged into near unrecognizability. even though no one recalled him shifting. Behind Margaret's right shoulder, a dark shape suggested a human form, slender, leaning, distinct enough to unsettle the eye. Experts consulted decades later would dismiss these anomalies with technical explanations. A moving subject could easily produce blur, especially with slower exposure times common to rural cameras. Chemical imperfections in the developing solution could create shadows, streaks, or distortions. Even the pressure of handling the plate might introduce marks that mimic human shapes. But villagers in 1920 did not need chemistry to understand what they saw. To them, the blur was a child fading, and the shadow was something that had no business being there. Historians point out that early 20th century America was deeply entangled with spiritualism. From seances in parlors to newspaper ads for mediums, there was a widespread belief that the dead could speak through photographs, voices, and table wrappings. Spirit photography, though exposed as fraud in many cases, had convinced thousands that cameras could reveal what human eyes could not. Against that backdrop, the Callahan photograph arrived not as an isolated curiosity, but as part of a broader cultural obsession. It is no surprise then that whispers of haunting took root so quickly. Psychologists studying the case decades later suggested that the photograph became a canvas for projection. The Callahans were respected but envied. Their farm prospered in lean years, their church pew always filled, their children well fed while others went hungry. The photograph's anomalies provided a perfect outlet for suspicion. When tragedy struck, the father's collapse, the daughter's disappearance, the boy's illness, the image served as a convenient scapegoat. People needed a story to hold their fear. Science might explain, but superstition gave coherence. Yet believers resist dismissal. They argue that the precision of the anomalies defies coincidence. The blur was not random, they insist, but targeted. Only Samuel, the child who would soon die young, was distorted. The shadow was not an indistinct smudge, but a figure aligned exactly where no one had stood. Combined with the sequence of deaths, the timing felt too uncanny, too aligned to be reduced to chance. Skeptics counter with statistics. In any community, children die, fathers collapse, daughters vanish in ways that remain unsolved. Coincidence, though painful, is not impossible. But believers respond with another kind of logic. If the camera had captured only accidents, why did those accidents seem to tell a story? The heart of the debate lies in how humans interpret images. Scientific analysis sees photographs as records of light and shadow, subject to mechanical error. Superstition sees them as portals, capable of revealing truths invisible to the naked eye. The Callahan photograph became an arena where these two interpretations clashed. For villagers steeped in biblical teachings and folk traditions, the shadow was not mere error but evidence of spiritual trespass. For outsiders with training in optics, it was no more than a shadow produced by uneven exposure. Both sides saw the same image. Both believed their view was obvious. This tension reflects a deeper human need, certainty in the face of chaos. When Thomas Callahan died, doctors blamed his damaged lungs. When Clara disappeared, authorities blamed a runaway impulse or an opportunistic criminal. But neither explanation satisfied the ache of the community. The photograph with its eerie distortions filled the void. It told them the tragedies were not random but connected, foretold and inevitable. Science insists on probability. Superstition insists on narrative. And in moments of grief, narrative often wins. The early 20th century was rife with tales of cursed images. Newspapers published accounts of death photographs in which faces of soldiers appeared before their deaths, or weddings captured omens of divorce and misfortune. Many such stories were fabrications, designed to sell papers to a public hungry for chills. But they fed into a cultural current that made the Callahan story plausible. In that cultural climate, a blurred face was not a glitch but a ghost, a shadow not a flaw but a spirit. Modern photographic experts analyzing the Callahan plate, now faded and brittle, see nothing beyond the ordinary. The blur could be explained by a restless child, the shadow by overlapping exposure. Some even argue the shadow was no figure at all but a stain introduced during decades of handling. Yet when these explanations are presented to descendants of the village, they are often met with polite silence. To them, the scientific answers strip the story of its meaning. If the tragedies were random, then their horror was meaningless. If the photograph was cursed, at least there was order, however dark. Psychologists studying belief point to this very dynamic, the need for pattern, even at the expense of truth. Humans are wired to connect cause and effect, to find agency where none exists. This tendency explains why gamblers see streaks where statistics see chance, why grieving families dream of messages from the dead. In the Callahan case, the photograph became the pattern, the proof that misfortune was not blind but deliberate. The villagers may have been wrong in scientific terms, but they were not irrational in human terms. They chose dread over randomness, story over silence. The cultural environment of 1920 Oklahoma also mattered. The Spanish flu had only recently swept across the world, leaving death in its wake. Communities scarred by sudden loss sought explanations that medicine could not yet provide. In that atmosphere, a photograph that seemed to foreshadow death resonated powerfully. Science was advancing, but superstition remained a balm. Better to believe that shadows held meaning than to accept the chaos of unseen viruses or the fragility of the human body. There is also the matter of memory. Over decades, the story of the Callahan photograph has been retold, reshaped, embroidered. Each retelling emphasized the supernatural elements, while the scientific explanations faded into footnotes. A blurred face became a vanished child. A smudge became a figure. The line between fact and folklore blurred, until distinguishing them became nearly impossible. Historians note that oral traditions often amplify mystery, while diminishing banality. Science may explain, but superstition endures because it is repeatable, shareable, gripping. No one tells their children bedtime stories about double exposure. They tell them about shadows that claim lives. Yet the scientific view refuses to vanish. Archivists who have studied the photograph point out how similar it is to countless flawed plates of the era. Photography, after all, was not infallible. Lighting conditions, shaky hands, uneven chemicals, any number of small errors could distort an image. Why elevate one flawed plate into myth while ignoring hundreds of others? The answer lies not in the photograph itself, but in the tragedies that followed. Without death, without disappearance, the image would be nothing more than a curiosity. Science explains the image, but superstition explains the timing. This duality, image as accident, image as omen, mirrors the broader struggle between logic and dread. Even now, with a century of photographic advancement, the debate persists. People today understand double exposure, yet still flock to forums debating ghost photos. They know about lens flares, yet still see angels in streaks of light. Knowledge does not erase fear. Sometimes it even intensifies it, forcing people to cling harder to mystery. The Callahan photograph stands at this crossroads, a case study in how science and superstition can stare at the same artifact and see two irreconcilable truths. In the end, the question lingers: does explanation kill mystery, or does mystery survive explanation? The Callahan story suggests the latter. Experts may detail every chemical flaw, but the legend persists, told in hushed tones in Oklahoma kitchens. For the community, the photograph is not about optics but about fate. For historians, it is not about fate, but about how humans construct meaning. Between these perspectives, the photograph remains alive, not just as an image but as a battleground between science and superstition. And so the debate continues. Was it merely a blurred plate, its shadow the product of careless handling? Or was it something more, a glimpse of forces beyond human comprehension captured for a fleeting instant in silver nitrate? Science insists we know the answer. Superstition insists we do not. In that tension, the Callahan photograph endures, a century-old reminder that sometimes what we fear is not the darkness itself, but the failure of reason to banish it. When tragedy strikes, the dead are often remembered through silence, but it is the survivors who carry the heaviest weight. In the story of the Callahan family, not every voice was extinguished. Some remained, broken, hesitant, fragmented, and over the decades, those voices became the only fragile link to a mystery that refuses to close. Their words, often contradictory, carry the pulse of trauma, half confession, half evasion. If the photograph was indeed cursed, it left scars not only on the bodies of those it marked, but also on the minds of those who lived in its shadow. Survivors spoke in whispers, if at all, and those whispers have echoed louder than any official record. The Callahan children who endured into adulthood did so under very different terms. Anna, the eldest daughter, was the one most willing to speak. Decades later, in a recorded interview conducted by a regional historian in the late 1960s, she described the photograph with a trembling mixture of awe and terror. She claimed that whenever her eyes met the shadowy figure in the background, the image seemed to shift. What first appeared as a blurred smudge lengthened into a man, tall and lean, standing just beyond her mother's shoulder. She insisted that he was not part of the original scene, for no man had been present behind them when the picture was taken. Yet in the years after her brother's death and her father's collapse, she began to see him more distinctly, as if the photograph itself had grown sharper with time rather than faded. Anna's account became a cornerstone for believers, proof that the figure was not imagined. Not a stain or a scratch, but something that revealed itself gradually, feeding on grief until it could no longer be ignored. Her younger brother Michael, however, refused to acknowledge the photograph at all. In family gatherings, when conversation veered toward the tragedies, his face tightened and he left the room. He burned every letter, diary entry, or clipping that mentioned the story. When questioned by his own children, he replied with silence so heavy it seemed deliberate, as though words themselves might summon something back. For skeptics, his silence was proof of rationality. He simply did not want to indulge superstition. For psychologists, it became evidence of repression, the coping mechanism of a boy who had lost too much too soon. Some argued that his refusal to speak revealed more than words could, a terror so profound that denial became his only sanctuary. The mother, Margaret, occupies a liminal space between these responses. Neighbors recalled seeing her in the yard late at night, burning papers and photographs in a tin bucket. One neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, swore that she saw Margaret feed multiple copies of the infamous photograph into the flames, yet the image survived because a single plate had been hidden away by a relative. Margaret herself never gave testimony. Her silence was both practical and symbolic. The act of burning was her answer. In her destruction of the evidence, she may have been trying to protect her children, or perhaps herself, from an image that had already swallowed too much. But fire is both erasure and confession. By burning it, she admitted its power. Over time, these fragmented testimonies acquired a rhythm of their own. One child insisting on the figure, another rejecting it, a mother erasing it. Memory itself fractured, leaving the story as incomplete as the surviving photograph. For every villager who claimed to have seen the image with their own eyes, there were variations in detail. Some said the figure was standing, others that it was crouched. Some said the blur resembled a hand over the boy's face, others that it was simply light. Oral history thrives on such contradictions, but they make the task of truth-seeking nearly impossible. The survivors' voices, instead of clarifying the mystery, deepened it. Psychologists analyzing these accounts argue that trauma reshapes memory like heat reshapes glass. Children who witnessed multiple losses in quick succession often carry distorted recollections, not as lies but as survival strategies. The human mind, overwhelmed by fear, reorders events to make them tolerable. Anna may not have truly seen the figure shift over time. She may have projected her grief onto the photograph, allowing her mind to create the continuity her heart required. Michael's silence, in turn, may not have been rational denial, but the only way he could prevent his memories from consuming him. Margaret's burning of the plates might not have been a concession to supernatural power, but an attempt to regain control over a world that had spun beyond her grasp. These interpretations do not rob the testimonies of their power. Rather, they remind us that memory is not a mirror but a prism. Historians examining the story have noted how survivor accounts often gain or lose weight, depending on cultural context. In the 1960s, when Anna spoke publicly, America was experiencing a resurgence of interest in the paranormal. Ghost stories, UFO sightings, and psychic phenomena captured headlines. Her testimony found a receptive audience precisely because people were ready to believe. By contrast, Michael's lifelong silence aligned with a mid-century stoicism that distrusted superstition. Each sibling became a mirror of the era's cultural divisions: belief versus denial, openness versus repression. That duality gave the story its staying power, ensuring that no single interpretation could dominate. Neighbors and extended family provided their own fragments. A cousin recalled that as a child, he had been forbidden to enter the Callahan house because Margaret believed the photograph cast a shadow over visitors. Another neighbor, interviewed in the 1980s, insisted that the surviving plate had been kept in a locked trunk, opened only once every few years, almost like a relic. Each account adds a layer to the myth, suggesting that even among those who survived, the photograph was treated less as an object and more as a presence, something alive enough to demand secrecy. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Anna, though outspoken about the figure she saw, struggled with recurring nightmares. She described dreams of standing in front of the photograph, only for the shadow to step out of the frame and into the room. These dreams haunted her for decades, affecting her relationships and her health. Michael, in contrast, developed a reputation for rigidity, insisting on order and silence in his household. His refusal to acknowledge the photograph was mirrored by a refusal to acknowledge emotions more broadly. Both siblings, though opposite in their approach, carried lifelong scars shaped not only by loss, but by the image that symbolized it. This duality, speech versus silence, testimony versus denial, raises questions about how memory functions under the weight of the unbearable. Survivors of tragedies often fall into these two camps: those who must speak endlessly to make sense of what happened, and those who cannot speak at all for fear of reliving it. The Callahan story illustrates this divide with brutal clarity. Every word Anna gave became fuel for belief, while every silence from Michael became fuel for mystery. Their testimonies, combined with their mother's desperate act of burning, created a mosaic that resists closure. Skeptics argue that these survivor accounts are unreliable, colored by grief, guilt, and fear. They point to inconsistencies. Anna sometimes described the figure as taller than her father, other times as shorter. Sometimes it leaned, other times it stood upright. Trauma, they say, is a poor historian. Yet believers argue that such inconsistencies make the accounts more authentic. Trauma survivors rarely produce neat narratives. Their stories wobble under the pressure of memory, but the raw emotion behind them testifies to their sincerity. Whether the details align matters less than the shared conviction that something unnatural clung to the photograph. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the survivors' accounts is not what was said, but what was left unsaid. Entire years of family history remain blank, as if deliberately erased. No letters describe the photograph after Margaret's burning. No journals, no sermons, no local records preserve discussion of it. Silence became its own testimony, an absence louder than words. In that silence, the photograph became myth, a ghost not only of shadow but of memory itself. Survivors may have tried to bury it, but their evasions gave it life, ensuring that every researcher, every curious neighbor, would wonder what they dared not say. In modern psychological analysis, the Callahan survivors embody the concept of trauma fragments, memories that surface in partial, distorted ways, refusing to form a coherent whole. Trauma does not narrate. It interrupts. Anna's visions, Michael's silence, Margaret's fire. These are not full stories but eruptions, and yet those eruptions are precisely what gives the legend its staying power. They resist resolution, leaving every listener unsettled, suspended between truth and invention. Survivors rarely give closure. They give questions, and those questions echo longer than answers. So the accounts remain: Anna's trembling confession of a man in the photograph, Michael's refusal to ever look at it again, Margaret's desperate destruction of its copies, neighbors' whispers of shadows cast over their home. Each fragment contradicts the others, yet together they form a chorus. It is a chorus marked by grief, dissonant but unforgettable. Survivors did not agree on what the photograph meant, but in their fractured testimonies they ensured that the photograph would never fade into obscurity. If silence is denial and speech is memory, then the Callahan family gave us both, binding the photograph in the paradox of being remembered and erased all at once. And in that paradox lies the true haunting. The photograph survives not because of what it shows, but because of what it refuses to let us know. Survivors carried the weight, passed it on in shards, and left behind a story that will never be whole. Their accounts remind us that tragedy is not measured only in the number of lives lost, but also in the fragments of memory that linger, broken and unhealed, ensuring that the mystery remains alive in every generation that dares to look at the image and ask what the survivors could not bring themselves to answer. The Callahan photograph, with its blurred child and the shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the frame, did not fade into obscurity as time passed. Instead, it grew heavier with each retelling, wrapped in layers of speculation, folklore, and scholarly debate until it became less an image than a mirror reflecting every fear, every suspicion, every unspoken truth of the community that surrounded it. To some, it was merely a damaged artifact of an imperfect camera, the natural result of cheap equipment and poor technique in an era when photography was still unreliable. To others, it was irrefutable proof that the Callahans had been marked, whether by a curse, by the weight of hidden sin, or by forces older and darker than the soil they farmed. What is striking is not only the content of the photograph, but the way it became a canvas upon which different eras painted their own anxieties. Each generation shaped its own theory, each explanation a reflection of the teller's deepest unease. One of the earliest and most enduring theories tied the photograph to land disputes. The Callahan family had settled on acreage that was contested even before they arrived, property with a tangled history of ownership, inheritance, and whispered betrayal. Some locals suggested that the Callahans' sudden prosperity, more cattle than neighbors, harvest that seemed unnaturally bountiful, was purchased at the cost of ethics. There were rumors that their land once belonged to distant relatives who had been denied their share of inheritance, or that documents had been manipulated to erase claims. In this interpretation, the photograph was not a supernatural curse but a symbolic one. Guilt crystallized in a single image, exposing the stain of dishonesty. Folklorists studying rural Oklahoma in the early 20th century noted how tales of land curses were common, reflecting both economic desperation and moral unease. The Callahan's blurred child and ominous shadow became metaphors for what could not be spoken outright. That prosperity gained unjustly cannot endure. That blood or deceit will surface no matter how carefully hidden. Another theory wove the tragedy into deeper, older histories. The belief that the Callahan farm had been built on Native American burial grounds. In towns like theirs, this was more than a cliché. It was a whisper carried down through generations, part fear, part guilt, part projection of the violence embedded in the land itself. Oklahoma, scarred by forced removals, treaties broken, and displacement, carried memories that could not be erased. To say the Callahan photograph bore a curse was in some ways to say that history itself was haunting the family. The blurred face of the child became a symbol of innocence lost, while the looming shadow was interpreted as retribution, a reminder that the ground remembers even when men do not. Believers insisted that the Callahans' misfortunes were not isolated, but part of a larger reckoning, a sign that the land itself resisted erasure. Skeptics scoffed at this idea, dismissing it as another way of romanticizing tragedy. Yet the persistence of this theory reveals something telling. People could not look at the photograph without feeling the weight of history pressing back at them. Folklorists later examined the way the photograph became a parable of moral decay. For them, the Callahan story served not simply as a local haunting but as a warning. Every detail, the blurred face, the unnatural shadow, the tragedies that followed, was retold in sermons, in cautionary tales, in hushed warnings to children. The photograph was presented as proof that hidden sins cannot remain hidden, that even in the most respectable households, secrets rot beneath the surface. Preachers in nearby towns sometimes invoked the story without naming the family, telling congregations that the Lord reveals what is concealed, even through man's machines. In this framing, the photograph was divine judgment, an uninvited confession captured on glass. For those who listened, the Callahan image was not simply about one family, but about the universal truth that darkness within a household eventually bleeds into the open. Of course, there were skeptics. From the moment whispers began, others pushed back with rational explanations. Photography, after all, was far from perfect in 1920. Long exposures made even slight movements into blurs, producing ghost-like streaks or duplicated forms. A child fidgeting on a porch could easily appear smeared when the plate was developed. Shadows were equally tricky, their angles often distorted by uneven sunlight, dirt on the lens, or a chemical flaw in the glass. To skeptics, the Callahan photograph was less a supernatural mystery than a case study in human projection. People saw what they wanted or feared to see. They linked natural misfortunes to the photograph not because of evidence, but because of a tendency to weave coincidence into story. The father's sudden collapse could have been a stroke, the daughter's disappearance a tragic but unrelated abduction, the strange lights in the windows, the result of faulty oil lamps. Poverty, disease, and misfortune needed no curse. In this view, the photograph was simply a scapegoat, a screen onto which a grieving community projected fears they could not otherwise articulate. Yet skepticism alone could not extinguish belief. For every technical explanation, there was a detail that resisted dismissal. Believers pointed out that the shadow did not fall in line with the sun's position, that it stretched in a direction impossible for the time of day. Others insisted that the blurred child's face was not merely smeared, but seemed deliberately obscured, as though a hand or shroud had been placed over it. And even if the tragedies were coincidental, why did they align so perfectly with the whispers surrounding the image? To skeptics, the answer was obvious. The human mind connects dots, crafting patterns where none exist. To believers, the answer was darker. Sometimes the pattern is real and denial is merely fear in disguise. The rise of psychology introduced yet another layer of interpretation. Scholars studying collective hysteria argued that the Callahan photograph was not dangerous in itself, but became dangerous because of belief. Fear once seated spread like contagion. A single neighbor's observation, "Doesn't that shadow look strange?" could ripple outward, infecting an entire community's perception. Soon every misfortune was tied to the image. Illness became evidence, silence became proof, tragedy became destiny. Psychologists cited other examples. photographs of ghosts in Victorian England, seances where a stray sound convinced participants of spirits, outbreaks of fainting in churches or schools. The Callahan photograph, they argued, was not cursed. It was contagious. The mind, when gripped by fear, reshapes memory and even perception. The survivors themselves may have genuinely seen figures in the image, not because they were there, but because the human brain, under duress, cannot distinguish between what is perceived and what is imagined. What is fascinating about these competing theories is not whether any of them are true, but how each reflects the anxieties of its time. In the 1920s, as communities clung to moral codes, the story was told as a warning about hidden sin. In the mid-century, as awareness of native displacement resurfaced, the burial ground theory took hold. In the 1960s and 70s, amid fascination with the paranormal, Anna's testimony was embraced as evidence of haunting. By the late 20th century, psychological explanations dominated, framing the photograph as a case of mass suggestion. Theories shifted not because the photograph changed, but because the cultural lens through which it was viewed changed. The shadow and the blur remained constant, but meaning morphed with each retelling. Even today, the photograph sparks debate online, where digital reproductions circulate on forums and blogs dedicated to mysteries and hauntings. Some users zoom in, insisting they see a figure with distinct features. Others argue it is nothing but poor resolution. Amateur historians connect it to other cursed photographs, such as the infamous spirit images of the Victorian era. Conspiracy theorists folded into broader claims about suppressed histories, suggesting that local officials buried evidence to protect reputations. In digital space, the Callahan photograph has taken on new life, its grainy details amplified by pixels, its meaning debated endlessly in comment threads that echo the very arguments of the past. Science against superstition, coincidence against curse, memory against myth. What all of this reveals is that the power of the Callahan photograph does not rest solely in what it depicts. The image itself, if seen in isolation, might provoke little more than curiosity. A blurred child, a shadow out of place, but layered with story, tragedy, and testimony, it becomes more than the sum of its parts. Its meaning lies not in the photograph itself, but in the beliefs it inspires, the way it forces people to grapple with questions larger than the Callahans. Do hidden sins leave visible marks? Does history haunt the present? Can fear shape perception into reality? Every theory, from curses to psychology, is less about the photograph than about those who interpret it. Perhaps that is the greatest legend of all, that the Callahan photograph is a kind of mirror. To those who believe in curses, it confirms them. To those haunted by guilt, it reflects justice. To scientists, it illustrates the limits of technology. To psychologists, it is proof of hysteria's reach. The photograph does not tell one story. It tells many, and in doing so, it refuses resolution. That refusal is precisely what keeps it alive. If a definitive explanation were ever agreed upon, the photograph would fade into history, another curiosity explained and forgotten. But as long as belief and skepticism remain locked in tension, the Callahan photograph endures. Less an image than an idea, a haunting not of shadow, but of interpretation itself. And so the legends continue, circling endlessly like vultures over the same photograph, each swoop revealing a different angle, a different fear. The land curse, the burial ground, the moral parable, the technical flaw, the contagion of hysteria. None erase the others. They coexist, clashing yet feeding one another, ensuring that no single voice dominates. The Callahan photograph remains suspended in that clash, its power not diminished by contradiction but amplified. For in contradiction lies mystery, and in mystery lies endurance. The Callahan farmhouse has long since vanished, its timbers collapsed and its stones scattered by decades of wind sweeping across the Oklahoma plains. Where once children played on the porch and fields rippled with wheat, only prairie grass grows, now swaying as though erasing the memory of what stood there. Yet while the house has been reclaimed by nature, the photograph endures. Fragile, cracked at the edges and yellowing with age, it passes quietly from hand to hand, a relic more disturbing than any ruin. Those who have seen it up close often confess to unease, an almost physical discomfort that lingers long after the image has been returned to its envelope. Some claim the blurred child shifts if you stare too long, that the smudge is not static, but alive, restless, reaching. Others insist that the shadow looming behind the mother seems darker with every generation, as though the act of observation itself feeds it. Historians argue the photograph is nothing more than damaged film, an imperfection of its era. Psychologists dismiss the dread it inspires as projection, fear stitched onto paper by suggestion and rumor. Local folklore tells a harsher truth, that the image is a warning, a testament that secrets always surface, that sins seep into the visible world no matter how carefully they are hidden. The tragedies that followed, the father's sudden death, the daughter's disappearance, the surviving children haunted by silences, cannot be neatly severed from the photograph in the imagination of the community. For skeptics, this is coincidence, elevated into myth, an example of how human beings refuse to accept chaos without narrative. For believers, the timing is too precise, the details too chilling to dismiss. And so the question lingers, suspended like the shadow in the frame. Was the family destroyed by chance misfortune, by the weight of their own hidden transgressions, or by something that stood silently behind them on the day the camera clicked? Perhaps the truth perished with the last survivor, who refused to speak of it. Or perhaps it never perished at all, but lies waiting, like the photograph itself, for new eyes to uncover what older ones could not face. Each generation reinterprets it, reshapes it, projects their fears into its grain. What was once a family portrait is now a canvas of dread, proof of nothing yet suggestive of everything. The photograph remains unresolved, both evidence and enigma, a story without conclusion. And so we return, again and again, not to answers, but to questions. Was it accident? Was it curse? Was it something that should never have been captured on film? The blurred child still looks outward, the shadow still hovers, and we are left to wonder whether we are gazing at the past, or whether the past, in its own dark way, is still gazing back.